Doctor Who Season by Season. Season 22 Review. Season 22 is one of the most controversial seasons in the history of Doctor Who. The crowning irony of this controversy is that little of it actually has anything to do with what is on screen and everything to do with what was going on off screen at the time. This is deeply unfortunate, as in my opinion Season 22 is not just the second best season of the 80s but one of the top 10 Doctor Who seasons ever made. So what gets fandom so het up over it even more than 3 decades later? The answer, of course, is that it was during this season that the show's fans first discovered that the show was not as immortal as they had previously believed and might, in fact, get axed one day. Which it did, temporarily, after this season. That shock to fandom's collective psyche resulted not just in this season unfairly getting the blame for this situation, but also Colin Baker, deeply unfairly given how utterly brilliant he is as the Doctor. Even over 30 years later the scars on fandom's sensitive behind have not fully faded, hence the hysterical overreaction from many in fandom any time anyone points out even the slightest criticism of the modern series, let alone when faced with the reality that the Moffat era has been unwatchable shit for many years now. But how and why did this situation come about? Simple really. In 1985 the BBC was looking to set up breakfast TV, something which would cost a fair bit of dosh, so they wanted to get rid of some shows to pay for it. This was also the era of Thatcherism and yuppies, so you get Thatcherite executives such as Michael Grade coming into the BBC, wanting to put their stamp on the corporation by sweeping away many older programs. Shows that were axed in order to pay for breakfast TV included many long-running and still popular programs such as police drama Juliet Bravo and perennial kids' favorite Crackerjack. Sadly Doctor Who also fell into this category as far as they were concerned. At this stage, it was nothing personal, though it is clear from later events that science fiction was not something beloved by Grade or BBC One controller Jonathan Powell. Ratings-wise Doctor Who was not the powerhouse it had been in the 70s, but nor was it a disaster either. In fact, the idea that the Colin Baker era is responsible for poor ratings is a complete non-starter. Aside from a spike for Peter Davison's first season, ratings for the show had not been as high as in the 70s pretty much since Tom Baker's last season, and Season 22 did about the same as Peter Davison's second and third season, and in fact even a little bit better. Fandom itself seemed to be quite happy with the season and the Sixth Doctor as well, until the axe came down. What happened next was basically a clusterfuck. The BBC had underestimated the affection felt for Doctor Who by the British public, and the outcry, some of which was orchestrated by producer John Nathan Turner, left them rather embarrassed in a very public way. Grade in particular must have felt like a little boy caught with his pants down. While JNT did manage to get the show a reprieve for a further 4 years, in other ways the media backlash may have done more harm than good, because while previously there had been no more animosity toward Who than the other shows given the axe to pay for breakfast TV, now it was personal. A series of ever more desperate excuses for the shoddy treatment of the program were put forth by Grade and Company, including the show becoming too violent, as JNT later noted. The likes of Powell had screened the season before broadcast and made no such comments at the time, to the production team and series becoming tired and complacent. Such savage public attacks by BBC management on one of their own series were unheard of, and the damage it did to the show's public profile was incalculable. The ratings fall suffered by the series from Season 23 onwards was almost entirely down to the perception of the series as a tired embarrassment, a perception actively encouraged by those in charge of the BBC at the time. After Season 23's ratings failure, an irony in itself given the BBC's public slagging of the production team was to, put the same production team back to work again, another scapegoat was needed, and sadly poor old Colin Baker was chosen as sacrificial lamb. Sadly fandom, always a sheep-like formation at the best of times, went along with this crap. The nonsensical perception that Colin was somehow responsible for the show's mid-80s collapse persists to this day in some corners of fandom, all based entirely on utter, self-justifying bullshit. Likewise, Season 22 continues to also cop similar flack, fandom rewriting its own history in the process to go along with the BBC propaganda of the time. What a bunch of utter, disingenuous, spineless bricks. Okay, so that's out of the way. We've established that any notion of the season itself, let alone the Sixth Doctor, was somehow the cause of the off-screen crisis, is complete horseshit. So what is the season actually like in terms of stories and such? Well, pretty fucking fantastic actually. The season kicks off with Attack of the Cybermen. I've got into this story in a couple of other vids, so I won't repeat myself too much. But this is a phenomenally unpopular story that deserves its reputation no more than Colin or the season as a whole. It's a cracking action story with terrific characters and performances, some stylish direction and some brilliant dialogue. It also sees the show, for arguably the first time since season 17, with the exception of the 5 Doctors, actually starting to dare to play with humor and fun again, even while telling a serious story. Colin's verbose, funky, sarcastic Doctor is partly the cause of this, as is script editor Eric Seward's obvious admiration for Robert Holmes, but thankfully the days of boring Bidmet putting red ink through any jokes in the script seem to be well and truly over by this point. Next up is Vengeance on the Rose. One of Colin's most well-liked stories. This is a cracking dark satire that has aged very well. At the time it was intended as a satire on video nasties, a rather sad, hilarious moral panic against cheap, harmless B-movie horror movies by a Puritan Tory government and an even more Puritan British media. Today however it seems like a remarkably prescient satire on reality television and a culture that treats the degradation and demonization of real people as fun entertainment. Colin is on fantastic form, Sil is a great villain and the story just works. Mark of the Rani is a fun little story, certainly the best from the less than celebrated writing team of Pip and Jane Baker. It's helped no end by sumptuous production values, and while this is certainly no classic, it's a fun little romp with great turns from Colin, Anthony Ainley as the Master and Kate O'Mara as the Rani. Some of the dialogue is hilariously verbose. The 2 Doctors is another gem. Many people slag this, though I've never quite figured out why, other than the decidedly lame too violent malarkey. These same people always seem perfectly fine with violence so long as Philip Hinchcliffe did it. Have you noticed that? It's not Bob Holmes's best script, but it's got some typically excellent dialogue. It's great to see Patrick Troughton and Fraser Hines as Jamie again, and Shockeye is a killer villain, who is hilarious and terrifying by turns. Time Elash is next and is one of the most hated stories in the show's history. To be fair, it is pretty shit. To be fair, it is better than it would have been if the terminally bland 5th Doctor had been in it, as Colin is wonderful and funny throughout, but yeah, it's not the best. Happily the season concludes with another classic in the form of Revelation of the Daleks. This is one of the darkest stories in the history of the show, the kind of tale you can no more imagine prissy, airy-fairy New Who doing than you can imagine Stephen Moffat letting someone stay dead, but boy is it a gem. One of the most bizarre Dalek stories ever. It's basically a jet black comedy thriller with some of the most grotesque characters ever seen in the series. Revelation is something special. Actually, so is season 22. The nonsense that still gets spouted about this season even today really does beg a belief. So often I see and hear the uninformed on YouTube and elsewhere spouting drivel like it's going out of fashion. Even the ones that have enough sense to not blame Colin for off-screen events and acknowledge him as a great Doctor, which he is, will still go along with the bizarro universe idea that the show itself was somehow to blame, and that he got bad scripts. This usually while singing the praises of the latest pile of crap to come out of Cardiff, right? Well, no offense or anything, But if you seriously believe that the likes of Closing Time and Nightmare in Silver are better Cybermen stories than Attack, or that any Dalek story in the last 8 years is better than Revelation, let alone that fucking Missy is a better master than Anthony Ainley, you can officially go fuck yourself. Season 22 is one of the best seasons of Doctor Who ever made, and I give it a well-deserved A.